Thank you very much. Um, like I said yesterday, I dabble into things that I didn't know or I don't know. Agriculture was my interest tangentially, but it has become of a much greater interest, and particularly from what we heard yesterday about, when you have problems or uncertainties regarding modeling, either because of data or because of the theoretical shortcomings in the framework of those models. And therefore, I'm the last one to try and model. So I prefer to look at the past because that's kind of given. It's easier to look at the past. And also, I really believe that if we don't really look at the past, we will not be able to draw the lesson for the future. And to me, agriculture provides perhaps one of the best lessons for all of us. For India, because even today, this year, if you read, follow news regarding famine and droughts across the world, there are at least 3 places, particularly in Africa, where drought and potential famine is threatening. Somalia, of course, Niger, Eritrea. The question is, and to me this had been the issue because ever since I started looking into this, the drought or famine today seems to be a very poor country phenomena. But drought and famine were not really phenomena restricted to today's poor country. They were there across the world. I mean, one of the most famous recent famine in Western Europe, the Irish potato famine in the 19th century, I mean, not only depleted its population by death, but also depleted its population by triggering perhaps one of the largest migration away from Europe into North America. So this has been there, but obviously there are ways and how some societies have moved on. For instance, if you Google, you will find that Australia would claim that they have been having drought for almost 10 years, that the rainfall has been scanty. But we really don't hear of famine or anywhere near malnutrition or scarcity of food in Australia. And this is what I think was India's last major drought. That was in 2009. It was a very significant drought. In fact, yesterday one of the slides showed that the dryness in North India contributed to the pollution load. Was it yours? One of the slides showed yesterday that how the sensitive zone in North India, the difference in 2008 and 2009, because 2008 was a good year in terms of monsoon, so the particles settled down, and 2009 was dry, and therefore it was pretty bad. And 2009 was pretty bad in terms of monsoon. 23% shortfall, which, if you went by Indian history, should have led to at least 1 million deaths. But the only thing we debated was price. So obviously something has changed. I'm not going, please, let me give a qualifier to start off with. I'm not saying there is no problem. I'm not saying that everything is grand and glorious in Indian agriculture. But we really need to, and this has been my prime interest as a generic framework, that we need to be able to really do an objective assessment of the pluses and the minuses if we are going to really successfully intervene in any policy decision. Typically, scaremongering on one side and predicting a land of milk and honey on the other is not going to lead us anywhere. Countries have tried that kind of an approach in policy advocacy and really worked. This is just on drought and famine, because I actually have a whole list of 1,000 years of recorded droughts in India. Because I was really fascinated by this issue, particularly in the 1990s when Bob Geldof had his aid for African famine. So I was really keen to know how it was, and I was really surprised that there are recorded history. It's not in terms of measurement in terms of rainfall, but recorded by historians whose texts are referred to today across the country. For 1,000 years, beginning with Kashmir, and they said, the Jhelum River was full of corpses because no one was left to burn the body. So they just dumped it on the river and had to carry it down. And of course, the Bengal famine of 43, and the last one, 65, 66, when for 2 years, about 500,000 to 750,000 people died each year, particularly in the north and eastern part of India. And of course, and you can see how a successful intervention can transform this so quickly. Because after 65, 66, of course, what we had was the beginning of the Green Revolution and the dwarf varieties of rice and wheat, the hybrid varieties. And within 10 years, we had felt the impact, which means the technology was not new. It was primarily the political and the policy environment that facilitated adoption of the technology. Because the technology by then, the hybrid seed technology was actually there since the 1940s. But this trigger, and this is one reason why Amartya Sen's theory of famine in a democracy is interesting. That while many other countries continued to have periodic famine, in spite of the technology, 65, 66 was such a great shock to the democratic structure that it allowed the kind of transition, even marginal, so that in it, this is actually, for many papers and us who referred to the IMD, the India Met Department, this is the birth of the Indian Meteorological Department, that the famine in South India. This was just 125, 130 years ago, and this actually led the British to create the Met Office to try and document rainfall and temperature, in the hope that at least they'll be able to predict and manage. 65, 66 was very similar, that the kind of death toll that we faced was so huge that the agricultural ministry and the policymakers really went out of the way to find a way out. And that's how the Green Revolution happened almost overnight. There are ways to define drought from meteorological, hydrological, and agriculture. We'll skip all that. This is droughts across the recorded history from the IMD, and you can see there's really no pattern. I mean, the nature is not biased against India one way or the other. This is again the drought areas and the flood areas. I had some flood and damage on that. This is the area affected under droughts. So you can again see there's not really any pattern in terms of the area affected. It's been consistent for more than 100 years now. Rainfall, again, there is not really any significant change. The blue line at the top, that's the one with an annual average. The rest are seasonal. January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, the monsoon season, and October, November, December. You really don't see much significant pattern in this is from 1813 to 2008, so it's a very long series. There's not much. This is the rainfall and the variation in rainfall. Again, you barely see, you could say there is 1 or 1.5% dip in this over a century-long pattern, but it's hardly a trend. But this is something that is, to me, is more interesting. That leaving aside rainfall, leaving aside temperature, the bars are the production, agricultural production, that it seems to have been risen quite consistently and quite significantly. Of course, I mean, today, this year, 2011, we are expecting in food grain, cereals, 250 million tons. In 1950-51, it was 50 million tons. So we are five-fold, 5 times larger in production base than then. But the rainfall seems to have not much effect. And this is what was my original, when I first started looking at these issues in 2006 and 7, my thing was that are we drought-proofing ourselves? Or what are the ways to drought-proof India or any other country from this kind of periodic natural hazards. This is acreage. The yellow one is the acreage, and you see the acreage is actually flattened, or there's a slight decrease. One reason is because multi-cropping has become much more prevalent, and therefore we don't really require that much of land for agriculture. Since the late 80s, the land has actually not increased, which is one reason why there has been consistently over the last 10 years, that from the satellite image, marginal increases in tree cover. I wouldn't say forest cover, because in the sense that forests, these were not natural forests, but plantation or other tree cover has increased across the country in most parts of the country. And one particular reason is that the demand for land on agriculture has been declining, because it is no longer there while the production has been going up. The other interesting thing is, of course, irrigation, which was the kind of a trigger for the green revolution, the first generation green revolution. Irrigation is still 50%, but you can see that even at 50%, we have plateaued the demand for land for agriculture. This is perhaps the most interesting thing, and I had not seen anybody, or I don't do much literature survey, because I just try to look at the data, because I'm not trained to do literature survey to first come to a conclusion. But I had not seen when I first compiled this in 2006, that anybody were really looking at it, although the data was there in the Ministry of Agriculture for all times, for anyone to see. What you see here are the Kharif and the Rabi. Kharif is the monsoon or the summer crop, and Rabi is the winter crop. In India, we have a very, very distinct rainfall pattern, which is we have a summer monsoon, which is the July, August, September, and then we have the winter monsoon, which is much shorter and much smaller in volume. But what you see here is that Kharif and Rabi has virtually balanced each other out as far as food grain production is concerned. That there is no major difference in terms of the share of production coming from Kharif and Rabi. When we started, or before Green Revolution, 66, 67, you see Rabi was half of Kharif. What has this done? This has actually taken the pressure off Kharif, because Kharif was completely dependent on rainfall, and if we had a drought year, Kharif used to be decimated to the extent of 10, 20, 30% of production could be affected. But this Rabi taking off that slack, which Kharif experiences during drought season or relatively dry seasons, that has actually reduced or almost eliminated the impact of declining production. Declining production has become much less significant than it used to be, and I have a slide to show that. And this has not, what is interesting here is, we all know that Kharif, for natural reasons, has more rainfall. Rabi in winter has much less rainfall. But with that less volume of rainfall, we are able to produce virtually the same amount that we are producing through Kharif, which means the potential for improving efficiency.
But isn't this different crops?
Cereal.
Isn't it different cereals that require?
There is a marginal difference, but not too much. Because of multi-cropping, Punjab grows as much rice, or today grows as much rice as it grows wheat. And Bengal and Andhra has rice at least twice, which means Kharif and Rabi. So it has changed. The product, state to state, it might vary. Like Punjab still has a huge wheat component, which Bengal doesn't have. But in terms of, because of multi-cropping, that divergence has declined. And which is why the water issue, the potential to improve water efficiency for agriculture is so enormous. That to me is very significant. Yes, sir.
Unfortunately, it has not increased the water efficiency. It actually increased the pressure on water utilization.
Yeah, so that is a management issue we should really discuss rather than the physical component of water.
The main reason why this has happened is, as I understand, is that the dependency of the agriculture on the rain-fed systems, rivers particularly, actually reduced drastically, and most of these farmers are now depending on water pumping. But that has put a huge pressure on the water system.
Correct.
So, and then it has also increased the soil degradation, because the time gap which is required between the two crops to recuperate, that time is also reduced. In fact, in between the Kharif and Rabi, they're also doing a third
crop. Exactly.
And that's a huge problem actually.
That is primarily a management problem, and it is very true, and not just for borewell. In fact, I know in Punjab that was one of the bigger issues, that the electricity was made free by the previous Badal government when they came to power, not this time. Now it's not so much free. What happened was you draw even more. When the irrigation doesn't provide you water, you tend to go down. And when the electricity is free, you try to draw even more. And when you don't have electricity, like it happened in Punjab in the mid 90s or late 90s, then you go for diesel. And that is one of the political feedback loops. I don't know, we have time to discuss, but this is, to me, is very interesting to understand how the interface between the physical forms or resources, the policy framework, and the politics interface, or, interconnects each other. Because it was that cost of diesel, which was rising while electricity was being said to be free, that actually contributed to the defeat of the Badal or the Akali government in the previous election. Because he made electricity free, Punjab, which had a surplus of electricity, had shortfall. Farmers depended on diesel. They realized they were spending much more on diesel than they would have spent on electricity, and voted wholesale the government out. To me, it is these interfaces that we need to understand if we have to make successful intervention. And this one actually shows that while it is true that our efficiencies are low, it has increased demand on the groundwater rather than surface water, but it also shows that these are management issues and not physical phenomena, which should be more in our control if we understand what are the sensitive points to press on.
But the idea, the point is that these management issues are actually going to lead to very clear physical phenomena as well. Because, for instance, all this drawing up of groundwater has actually led to a salinization of a lot of lands in coastal areas. And and therefore, by sort of saying that you are sort of not having famines right now because you just have access to more energy sources to draw out the groundwater, you're actually creating a bigger problem for the future, where your sort of coastal lands are actually becoming more and more saline, and people are actually giving up lands because they were so saline, because of sort of drawing up of groundwater. And of course, contamination of groundwater with arsenic and things like that, and also because of this excessive drawing out of water. So I think the entire story is a lot sort of, there is another aspect of this which is actually going into how your physical processes are actually going to change as a result of what you call management issues of groundwater.
The only difference is it's very true that it will leave an impact on the physical process. Naturally, it ought to. It inevitably will. The question is, what is triggering what? If it was, as it was seen, or as even today people would say that the drought in Niger is a natural phenomena, then of course you blame God or you ask the rich to pay for it. If you think it is not a natural phenomena, it is being triggered by policy framework one way or the other, positive and negative, then we are in much greater capacity to respond effectively to deal with it. Because if it's left to nature, then it's natural, we have no control. Otherwise, it's left to the rich to pay for the suffering of the poor, and we beg. And we used to. Before 65, 66, that was, till 65, 66, that was our situation. In fact, even there were books, in fact, one of my first time I came to IIT Kanpur when Munmun invited me, we were discussing population. You were there, sir. Yeah. And this was one of the first points that used to come up, that India cannot feed itself. What I'm trying to say, that's why I said that these things are not, I'm not promising milk and honey. What I'm saying is that we must understand the factors that are within our control, we can do something and get a desirable outcome, than either propose a panacea or a doom. Because those two scenarios to me does not really help us do anything, because if you are promising a panacea, either we should be held accountable, we won't, because it will happen 100 years later, or if you are promising a doom, then of course everything goes down. So I think it is for this reason that I wanted to stress this, that things that we can do, we can try to understand to help improve the situation. It will not happen overnight, but the marginal improvements can and would happen if we really understand the factors. Okay, I already said that the irrigation has increased and the production has increased from 50 to 250. And I basically looked at food grain because in a poor economy, food grain is one of the cereals are the prime sources. So to me, there are a lot of things that have happened to some extent. Water, there are problems, but it is obviously Rabi would not have been possible without irrigation. The seeds have changed. The agrochemicals have changed. The crop management techniques, the market access and lack of it is still there. Yeah. This was the other side that I wanted to say. That was more about production. To me, famine is not just about production; it's also about prices. And this is or the wholesale price index for agricultural commodities and the food grain production. The red line is the price, and you see how it has risen. And this is the price index. So this is not inflation. This is primarily the rise for inflation for one reason or the other. And you see the production and price, and which is why, and price is critical to understand this, because it is the price that affects the poor. Like today, or 2009, or 2010, when we had all those reports on television showing that, that the food grain was rotting, and malnutrition was still prevalent. No, it was that the distribution channel and the pricing mechanism was just not right. And to me, that was the reason to look at price. And from the physical side of it, you can see from this one that the vertical bars are change in production, and the red line is change in prices. You'd see the peaks on the left-hand side and the right-hand side, they're so different. Because at that time, even a marginal variation in production led to a much higher swing in prices. And it is that swing in prices which makes products inaccessible to the poor, because they cannot predict. And there's another reason for that also, and this is another thing that you can actually see how it is man-made, or India-made in this instance. This is the last 10 years price inflation on food, and you see the India, the green and the red at the top, that curve is the India curve. This one. Why are we so higher than the rest of the world? Not because God is against us, but because we have managed our macroeconomy and monetary policy in a manner that has invariably led to it, and many of us believe NREGA too contributed to it. That a lot of spending has gone in, a lot of money has been released, and which is why I would say that I take it with a pinch of salt when the finance minister tells us that inflation is a global phenomenon. It is a global phenomenon, but we have done much worse than the globe, which is in our hands. And we should not let the political establishment get away by presenting it as a global phenomenon and therefore outside our country. This I already said, that the price fluctuations have moderated. This last point is actually the interesting one, and I had some data. I don't know if I'll be able to show it in time. That how the consumption, the food consumption has changed as India has climbed. And this is nothing unusual. This I'll skip, I think. I think we can discuss this because this is related to price and poverty are quite related. But one reason why none of us in this room are dependent on agriculture is because of this. This country, we had 50% GDP, 55% GDP and 72% population on agriculture in 51. Today it is 18 and 56. It's not a surprise that rural poverty has been so endemic. And because poverty has been so endemic that we figure so differently in this chart, because there is not a single country which is rich, which is so heavily dependent on agriculture in terms of human beings. Agriculture value added at a percentage here, and the population or the employment in agriculture here and here. see the difference. Not because US is less dependent on agriculture. US is one of the largest producer of agricultural produce in the world. But barely 1% of its GDP and 1.5% of its population. Therefore, there's not much of a difference. And this you can see here also. In terms of land productivity, cereal yield per kg between the high income and the low income, middle income. It's got nature has nothing to do with it. We have everything to do with it. That's my whole point. Because if we accept that we have everything to do with it, then the onus is on us to figure out what is it that we can do to intervene and not let somebody else blame it on third factors and get away with it. The same thing with labor productivity, which is the reason why it is United States is 1% and 1%, because there's hardly any price differential between labor productivity in agriculture and non-agriculture. 40,000, this is actually higher than, this is actually, I think, the US current poverty line, I think, is about $15,000 or $18,000 per capita. So you can see how high it is. Whereas here, we say we are 1,000 plus, and labor productivity in India's agriculture is barely 500, whereas our per capita average is 1,000, because agriculture is so low in productivity. This is the same thing in another form for G20 countries, and you can see the dots are the agriculture as a share of GDP. Higher the agriculture as a share of GDP, greater is the poverty. We claim ourselves that, Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan, so we believe that we are an agricultural country. We do ourselves a great disservice, particularly to the farmers. We hail them as a hero. It's just like hailing the goddesses. We hail the goddesses and then kill the female baby. So we hail the farmer and then do everything to make them impoverished and starve them to death. This is the change that has happened, and we all actually got to encourage and see how this can, this is the change in consumption pattern in food, which I said because this is where the price is so significant. Poorer we are, 27th round was in 1974, poorer we were, higher was the consumption of cereals. To the extent we have climbed, in the latest one is 2005, 61st round, to that extent, the consumption of cereals have come down, and to that extent we have insulated ourselves from acute starvation. Because this is what was, and this you see the same thing across rich and poor countries. Food items in the US is less than 10%. For us, here, it's almost 40%. This is what is poverty. This is why price is so critical, not production. And this is what I think we can, the potentials are huge, because we are nowhere near world standards if you even have some time to look at the comparison between what we produce and what the global bests are in crop after crop. Which means it's that current technology we can rapidly ramp up production if we have firstly the understanding and then the willingness to allow it to happen. Because one of our problem is, and this is my last thing, one of our critical problem in agriculture is the mindset of people like us in this room. Those of us who don't depend on agriculture for livelihood think agriculture is sacrosanct, has to be maintained. What we actually mean is somebody else should maintain it, pay with their lives so that we in this room can go on living ours. That to me is socially, politically, economically unviable. It's impossible. And, should we have people stay in rural area, or ask the Chief Minister of Delhi? One of our main grievances is that people are coming from rural to Delhi. And she says that it's not a good thing. Most Chief Ministers would say the same thing. Why? None of us in this room are really crying to go back to the original village wherever our ancestors came from. Why do we expect somebody else to carry the burden of our own lack of imagination? That to me is the real change in climate that I think we have been seeking in this round of discussions and debate. We need to change the intellectual climate of ours, because the bottlenecks are there. Doesn't matter whether the climate is changing, I might be a climate skeptic. I have substantial reservation on whether it is anthropogenic or not. That's beside the point. None of this depends on that. And this is, this last thing I think you should really remember. Politically, the poor have many problems, and if they don't survive the present, they give a damn to what we think what's going to happen 50, 100 years down the road. They'll give a damn. It will get reflected in the votes. Nothing we say will count. Which is why if we really care, we must understand, which is why I said, this is why probably this session is politics and economics. You said that no one will talk on politics. But I think this is a very political decision. We need to understand how it is made so that we can have a meaningful impact for the better. Otherwise, we will become irrelevant. Politics will not. Politics reflects what the largest number thinks. And this is extremely critical, this point, that we are concerned about 50, 100 years down the road, which is why UNFCCC is in a deadlock. UNFCCC is in a deadlock for the last 5 years, and I don't think it will be broken no matter who does what, because it is impossible to break the political logjam. And the political logjam is because of this. Countries like India and China cannot sacrifice any longer the present for the poor, thinking of the future of the rich. That is not a bargain that's on the table. It will never happen, at least not in my lifetime or most of our lifetime.
So solution, you're saying industrializing agriculture.
Not industrializing. Industrializing can, it is to two things: increase productivity, whether you industrialize, increase productivity, but whichever way. People are not so much bothered about how the electricity comes.
What is the problem with it? And everybody is for it.
Which one? The problem is the mindset. That's what. Because we do, you say somebody like our former president, Abdul Kalam. He had this famous proposal, urban amenities in rural areas. The whole idea being, Pura. The whole idea being, we'll keep population there. We'll keep them dependent on that. It's impossible. Which is why none of us, just think, we all say urban issues, we'll discuss in IIT Delhi, slum. Why is it a slum? Because they migrate. Why don't we think it's a slum? 100 years ago, India had no slum. Why India had no slums 100 years ago? Because the housing was not as restricted as it is today. Today, you can build 5-star apartments. You can't build low cost. No one will build low cost because there's no monetary structure to finance it. And therefore, people go on the slums. And we say that slum is a problem, not the housing policy that we have restricted. Exactly the same thing here. We are simply not being able to think that in order to develop this phenomena, we must really be able to adopt. And this is global, historical. There is no way to break it. That the only way countries have developed, doesn't matter capitalist, communist, whichever, only way countries have developed economically is by improving agricultural productivity, allowing people to move away from land-dependent agriculture to non-agricultural areas, and allowing that transition to happen. We have done everything to stop it.
Talking about policy in a very apolitical way. It's not that it's low-cost housing, but it's all about real estate. Who are the major players? And what we call the second circuit of capital.
What Sanjay said a little earlier, the way he said about the diesel taxes, or the petrol taxes and the diesel, this is man-made. What I'm trying to say is that all the points that you raise would be man-made. That is, the land issue is of course a big issue. Just like tax is a big issue. Why should a bus pay 1 lakh rupiah tax per year? There's no justification rationally that we can provide. That's how it is. Exactly the same issue for land. That urban land today is so restricted that it is absurd to think of any developer in any rational economic thinking would construct low-cost housing.
No, but that's already happening. There is a large program of the government of India which has just been launched called Rajiv Awas Yojana. There has been Indra scheme in rural areas. That's already happening. If you see, the point is, I don't think you can have such broad sweeps. You can't have such broad sweeps and say nothing's happening.
No, I didn't say nothing is happening. I said so much has changed.
Policy issue so much.
And
Who is influencing the policy?
Us.
It is the real estate, at least in the urban scenario.
I think you're talking about special interests.
The way the urban sprawl is taking place today, those buildings and all those housing complexes, it's like a sprawl situation.
Unfortunately, over the years, even till now, India did not encourage urbanization,
Yeah.
which was very unfortunate. The reason is urban areas are the key engines of growth. No country can grow without urbanization.
This is what it
And
shows.
people have been very apologetic.
Not urbanization, the planned urbanization.
Whatever it is.
Whichever way you want to do it.
So you try, see, how do you increase agriculture productivity? You can increase agriculture productivity only by having capital intensive technology. If you have capital intensive technology in agriculture sector, many people would become redundant. Many people would become worthless. They have to be moved away from rural areas to somewhere else, to industry and services.
Non-farm
They have to
activity.
be trained adequately only to
That's absolutely
get
not
adopted.
true. That's absolutely not true. That you actually have to enhance
Yes.
the productivity from existing levels, that you need to have capital intensive.
Then how would you do that? How would you do that?
Look at the current management
Yeah,
practice. Look at the current management practice. That says, look,
throw another question, a little bit different than this. See, you showed one slide where you said that in India we spend a significant part of our earnings on food. And that probably explains the poverty line. And yet, there is impoverishment amongst farmers. So, what is happening? I mean, if I am spending most of the money I earn on my food, then why is the farmer not getting it? I mean,
We were just discussing this before the session started. Just this point. That this is exactly the paradox, and these are all in our hands. For instance, isn't it amazing that doesn't matter what the price is in the market, the people, the traders, those who are selling it, they always have their margin, because their margin is based on what they buy at and what they sell at. And at the farm gate, whether it is a drought year or whether it is a bumper crop, both tend to be disastrous. If it is drought, farmers don't have production, so there is no price, so he collapses. If there is bumper, there is no transport, there is no storage, and he gets a low price, the middleman makes a profit. That, one reason why so many state governments have been urged to scrap agricultural produce marketing system, the mandi system, whereby you are tied to a particular mandi. Why? So these are all structures that came from our mindset from a different era, which we are struggling to overcome. The question is, do we really know? I'm not saying that I have all the answers for everything that you're going to ask. What I'm only suggesting is that we really must think much more aggressively, question our own beliefs that much strongly. Because these are all our own creation, exactly like you said. Why is it so? It is a paradox. It is a very big paradox. That the farmers are screwed no matter which end they are.
So maybe we can continue this discussion outside. Thank you, Samit.